Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. I'm Stephen, your host, and I'm thrilled that you can join us, genuinely thrilled that you can join us this week. Our very, very, very special guest today is Reverend Lindsey Sanderson. Hello, Lindsey.
Hi there, Stephen. Good to be with you.
Welcome. Lindsey is a URC minister serving as the moderator of the National Synod of Scotland since January 2024. Currently representing the Synod Moderators on the JPIT strategy group. Commitment to social justice it forms a strong part of her Christian faith. And she's privileged to have served as a trustee of Christian aid and global ecumenical experiences through Council for World Mission and as a URC representative on the World Council of Churches Central Committee. Lindsey has interests in liturgy, writing liturgy, that includes hymns, words, and sharing liturgical resources all over the world church. Lindsey lives in Glasgow with her husband, an older daughter, and their dog called Hamish. That's a fantastic name for a dog. Again, our very special guest today from JPIT is Thomas. Thomas is the intern for the Constituency Action Network, and it's always a pleasure to have you with us here on the line, as it were. Now, Lindsey, we often ask our guests this very special question: does politics belong in the pulpit?
Yeah, well, I certainly think it does. I think Christian faith is about embracing the whole of life, every aspect of our living, and we are, whether with a capital P or a small p, political animals. And so, therefore, as for myself, along with many millions of other people in the world, my Christian faith informs the way in which I make political choices when I'm casting my vote, or other ways in which I'm engaged in my local community. And also, not just in a sense how I exercise my privilege of voting, but how I engage with elected representatives, with campaigns and advocacy for those who are less able to express their voice or whom society is less willing to hear. So for me, politics absolutely belongs well in the pulpit, in the church family, and in the communities in which we're set.
Amen to that. That's a fantastic answer, and we love that. That's why we've invited you to have you on the show. Okay, so let's get some context now with the news headlines from this week. Now, please do bear in mind, these are the news headlines at the time that we are recording, so they might be a little out of date when you come to listen to the podcast, but however, that's still useful for the conversation in the days and seasons that are ahead. So the first headline was: a man has been charged with the attempted murder in Cambridgeshire following the train stabbing and a London attack as well. 3 more hostage bodies have been recovered to Israel from Gaza. Israeli strikes have killed over 220 Palestinians since the ceasefire. Mass killings by the militia in El Fasher, Sudan. There's been a landmark renters' rights bill that's been passed by the UK government at the end of last week. And we're looking to the beginning of COP30 in Brazil on the 10th of November. And our lectionary readings for this Sunday, the 16th of November, 2025, that's, I believe, the 23rd Sunday after Pentecost in Year C, if you're interested. Our readings are Isaiah 65, chapter 65, verses 17 to 25, and then Isaiah 12, or Psalm 118, and we're also going to be looking at 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 6 to 13. And then we're going to hop, skip, and jump to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, verses 5 to 19. Now, I'm going to share with you that there's several things for you to be aware of in these coming days. There's themes for you to bear in mind this week. And there's 2 that come to mind for me. This week is the end of Interfaith Week. Now, if you aren't aware, Interfaith Week is a time to celebrate diversity of faith across beliefs in the UK. It encourages understanding, dialogue, and shared action between communities, reminding us that listening and working together across our differences can strengthen both our faith and our common life. It's also Social Care Sunday. That's a Sunday set aside by many churches in the UK to recognize, celebrate, and pray for all of those involved in social care. That's carers, care workers, volunteers, families, and people actually receiving care. I think there's a lot there that we can pay attention to and pray for in the coming days and seasons here. So we encourage you and your congregation to explore creative ways to respond, to pray, to campaign, and do whatever you can to take local action towards a fairer, freer world. So, with all of that in mind, let's have a look at the texts. Lindsey, is there a particular passage that you would preach from or a theme across the lectionary text that you've picked up today?
I think one of the things that I would notice looking across the text is that we're getting close to Advent. So
Oh,
Advent Sunday is
yes.
just a couple of weeks in advance. Um, and I think as we look at that, we can begin to see hints of some of the themes that come out for us in the season of Advent. And one of those for me is justice. I think of all the liturgical seasons, for me, Advent and justice go hand in hand together. Um, I think I would begin by looking at a passage from Isaiah 65,
Yes.
which paints this wonderful picture of God's new community of hope. That ties in with me with images about justice, which is at the core of that community of hope. And I think it's really interesting to look at the Isaiah passage and to look both at its context, speaking to a people who are in exile and how they are using some of the history of their people as they've kind of written it down in the stories of creation, and how creation gets a kind of twist in this vision of what God's new community of hope is like. And for me, what comes out is that there are key themes. There are themes about God creating and God rejoicing. And those are really kind of central to this text. And I think they're central about who God is. God is the creator of everything that is seen and unseen, all that we can grasp, and all that we've still yet to learn about this amazing universe that we live in. And I guess linking in with the fact that COP30 is just about
Yeah.
to begin, that's a really nice link for us to think about God creating and how God continues to create, and how we, in some ways, act as co-creators with God in the way in which we are engaged in living alongside our common home as part of it, but also having responsibility for stewardship and for care and for ensuring that we don't have this completely human-centric view of the world where we, as we have so often in the past, have been engaged in exploitation and have had no regard for our common home. So I think there's something there that is really interesting to pick up on, and that, you know, as we read in the Genesis stories, and it's echoed here in Isaiah, God rejoices. The creation is good. God rejoices in everything that is made. And I think, you know, that's my approach to life. Yes, there is evil in the world. We have to name that, but creation is good. And how can we build on that as we share this common home together? And Interfaith Week is a really great example of how we can, as people of faith together, can act together for our common world, picking up on the idea of, principle of, doing what to other people that you would expect them or want them to do for you. How can we learn and listen from one another, respecting our different religious traditions, and together as people of faith work for the good of our communities and our world. So there's some of the things that I would initially pick up in Isaiah's vision. And then he kind of goes on to talk about, well, what is this new world like? And he speaks about people who have had an experience of trauma but now have food security. People who have been nomadic in wilderness, perhaps now having a place where they can build a home and they can live and they can settle. And these seem to me, again, very contemporary hopes for our world, for millions of the world's people. And so, again, a direct relationship with justice and with many of JPIT's 6 hopes in terms of a just economy, having care for the poorest and the most marginalised in our society to be at the centre. Again, the emphasis on environment, on welcoming the stranger, and a whole politics of listening and kindness to one another. So I think Isaiah paints this really imaginative, hopeful picture of what the world could be like. And then it has this kind of idea of prey and predator sitting down together, and that in some senses seems nonsensical. It seems like it's something that would never happen. But a phrase that really struck with me was one that Barack Obama used about the audacity of hope. And so here we have this image of a wolf and a lamb sitting and living in harmony together, and that is the audacity of hope, the courage to believe that actually that's the world that could be possible. And if we can be infected by that, then as people of faith, I think we can play our part in ensuring that the kingdom will come. So there's lots for me in there. I find this a really energizing passage, and one that I think really can give us encouragement as we prepare for the season of Advent.
I love that reminder there of being infected by the audacity of hope. Words from Barack Obama there. That's a fantastic reminder there, Lindsey. Thank you. Thank you for all that you've shared. Thomas, is there anything that you've gleaned from Isaiah, the new creation?
Sure. I think, I completely agree with you, Lindsey. I'd also pull out the kind of the idea of renewal, maybe the idea of the world being turned upside down. Quite like that as a phrase. That there's the hymn, the Canticle of the Turning. I'd recommend that as a reflection of that. And I like the way that it's the world being turned upside down, perhaps in the ways we'd expect, talking about building of houses, food security, as you said, but also, this almost magical predator and prey sitting alongside each other. The programmed logics that we're used to in our world can be upended. And I think that's really special to focus in on when we think of the power and the reach of God can change the things that we find impossible to imagine, how something so fundamental to the way the world operates can change, but it can, and it's specifically mentioned. And I think that's probably the intention for readers across the centuries. That's something that maybe all human beings reading that passage can really get, is the fundamental logics of the world will change and can change. That's pretty amazing. I'd in terms of the interfaith approach, as well as thinking about our shared kind of vision for the world, it also makes me think about our humans' ideas for a utopia, a shared utopia, a kind of longing for something more or something else. And that is something that we can actually find in common with people of other faiths, whether we kind of look up into space, through space and time, whether it's up and down or kind of into the past or into the future. There is definitely a common human desire to look for the unknown or the otherworldly, the supernatural. And I think that so those bigger ideas can be something that we take in our interfaith approaches, that map pretty nicely onto the kind of smaller scale practical relationship building that we do. The other thing I might like to specifically point to would be sometimes in the passages like this, where there's a lot of prophesizing, of kind of thinking about utopia or of a new Jerusalem, it can be quite easy in some ways maybe to over spiritualize. I don't think that's what we've done here at all, but I want to point to the practical idea that, you know, for example, for Palestinian Christians, the idea of the people of Jerusalem being renewed, you know, no longer weeping that people won't labor in vain, bearing children doomed to misfortune. In verse 23, that's a very practical concern for the Jerusalem that we have here now in our world. You know, this is not something that's we can, having just talked about the idea of utopia, there's also this really grounded practical idea of what change and justice might mean. I really like that essence of human flourishing in verse 23. That's really powerful, I think, particularly for, you know, people in the global south, people suffering the inequality and injustice of the world, as a form of hope that is not just pie in the sky, but is very practical and very reachable within our timeline.
I was just reminded when Thomas was speaking there of a slogan that Christian Aid had a good number of years back now, but we believe in life before death. And
Yes.
that, you know, I think that was there. Absolutely, Thomas has helped us just to focus in on. But yes, this is not just something that is in the realm of the world that is to come, but here and now we can be involved in as well. And we need to be, as we listen to the cries of our brothers and sisters around the world. Yeah.
Thank you, but I think you really highlighted that, Lindsey and Thomas, there, because I think verse 24 speaks to that tension that we're thinking about there. It talks about before they call, I will answer. While they are yet speaking, I will hear. It's just a reminder for us that, you know, God walks alongside us. It's another reminder of that promise, I will never leave you nor forsake you. These are things that when you're in the midst of, you know, that brokenness, it's hard to imagine, but you know, we're talking about God doing the impossible here. The lion and the lamb, the wolf and the lamb laying together. That's not something that is normal. But you reminded me, Lindsey and Thomas, of the fact that God makes justice tangible here in this reading. There's peace, there's prosperity, there's joy as a shared reality for everyone, for every single person, and that's fantastic, especially in the light of this renters' rights bill that's coming up. They shall build houses and inhabit them. I think it's a basic human right to safe housing. Yet still in this day, in 2025, it's November, some people don't have that basic right in this country and beyond. So I think there is still yet work to do and still yet more to pray about and to act upon. So we do pray for what Isaiah's prophecy, that new creation to become tangible and for us to be renewed by this vision too, this new heaven and this new earth. A community where no one labors in vain or dies too soon. So there's lots there to get excited about. So I hope in your preaching preparation, listeners and viewers, that you are just as excited as we are, because this is fantastic. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to geek out. We're gonna go on. I think let's travel to 2 Thessalonians. Why not? Chapter 3, verse 6 to 13. Now I like to give myself themes and titles. I've thought about perseverance and responsibility. Responsibility is one of my favorite words because I heard a sermon that really impacted my life. It broke the word into two: responsibility, response, and ability. Each person responding in their own God-given ability. So I am very, very keen to hear what you both took from Paul's encouragement in this letter, especially if you're maybe fatigued, like I am, or like others are. But what did you get from this reading?
Well, I have to say that I discovered something new when I was doing some reading on this, and this has taken me down a particular pathway that I thought was really interesting, and I think relates very much to JPIT's kind of overall vision about justice. I was reading a commentary on this passage by somebody called Nijay Gupta, who's a New Testament scholar. I have to say that I haven't come across his work before. And he related this passage very much to theology of work, a theology of work and labour. And again, you see, that just sparked connections with me about a just economy, and making sure that those who work are properly rewarded for their labour, whether that's about a minimum income guarantee. It's something that has been talked about certainly in Scotland, or the broader fair trade movement that we are very much familiar with. Across the global south in particular. So he was talking about this, and this is where a lot of this hangs on the translation of a particular word, and that's where I started to get kind of intrigued by it all. The passage talks about idleness, and he offers, instead of thinking of that word in terms of being idle or being lazy, he says another way of translating that is about people who make trouble, who go out to make trouble. And so what he is offering, and what he's suggesting, that what Paul is saying in this passage is that as Christians, we are called to a day-by-day faithfulness, recognizing that some of the people in the Thessalonian church thought that the end of the world was nigh. And saying that what we're called to do is not to give up because we think the day of the Lord is coming very soon, not to engage in kind of making trouble or being busybodies in light of this scenario, but what Paul's encouraging us is to a day-by-day faithfulness, which we could characterize as a bit of a keep calm and carry on.
I love that.
And that also kind of reminds me of the words of St. David, which he is said to offer to his followers just before he passed away, which were to be joyful, keep the faith, and do the little things that you have seen and heard me do. And I just find such encouragement from those words in my own kind of walk of faith. So kind of Gupta is saying that this passage can help us to promote honest work for those who are able to work, and that very much is about a link with justice, as I said, with minimum income guarantee, with the way in which disability benefits in particular perhaps are being eroded in many different ways. He says we should use this to encourage the people to follow the example of Paul, who was working not for himself but for others, to support others within the church rather than building up his kind of esteem as a leader. And to kind of teach people to live a quiet life, a life of contentment and fulfillment. And that also seems quite countercultural to some of the messages that we receive about, I guess, what we would know as the American dream, or, reaching that position of security through wealth or possessions or status. And all these things, he would say, combine in a theology of work or labour, which is really important because, millions again of us are engaged in work. And it's important for our own fulfillment that it's a good experience if it possibly can be. And it's another significant place where we live out our Christian faith in action. So, as I say, this was all new to me, but I was quite taken by what he was offering in terms of looking at this passage and thinking about work in particular.
So interesting. You've reminded me of a book by John Mark Comer. It's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Because I was thinking as you were speaking there about, what's the difference between, we all live busy lives, but what's the difference between busyness, that's BUSYNESS, busyness, and faithful workness. Let's call it that. What is the difference between the two? What energizes us and allows us to keep persevering and doing the faithful work and not tiring of doing the good thing, as it were? Thank you for that, Lindsey. I'm excited, but I'm going to go and find out a bit more about that, the person you just shared, because that's new to me too. I love that, theology of work. Thomas.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it's one of those passages that can be a bit confronting. And something I found important really was maybe taking a step back and thinking about the context of the community this was being read to. That I think it's quite easy. We've got a lot of cultural scripts, as you said, Lindsey, about what laziness is and what idleness is. I have not translated idleness in that way, but I would point out the verse 11 has this really interesting phrase in the NIV, idle and disruptive, which reads like an oxymoron. But if as you've said, you translate idle as a bit more of as disruptive, and that makes sense. So that was an interesting point. But just reading the kind of scripts that we have about laziness, idleness, work, fecklessness, you might say. I think it's really important to take a step back and remember that what we don't have, that the communities being responded to by Paul and Timothy here, is a basis of community, of being reliant on one another. That we are so used to this, as you said, the American dream, or an individualist, economically rationalist perspective as our kind of root for the last 500 years of the West anyway. And it's easy to come at that starting point. But we have to remember that what we don't have is this fundamental sharing, communitarian mode of living. And as we read in Acts, that's what the early church did, sharing their possessions in common. So it makes a lot more sense, once you've got that in mind, for there to be conversation about responsibilities in work, because there's already an assumption that that people have responsibility to each other in the way they work. If we don't have that important bit of context, then it's very easy to start scapegoating and start pointing down. And I would worry about this passage being used, to target stereotyped, scapegoated, marginalized groups who are lazy or idle. I am thinking about Social Care Sunday. I was a care worker in L'Arche, which is a charity working with people with and without learning disabilities, with Catholic roots. I'd encourage you to have a look at it. And something we really thought about in that caring environment, especially working with people with learning disabilities, is how important it was to never see anyone as passive or static, whether they had a learning disability or not, but very much that the responsibility was on everyone in the community to find good, appropriate forms of work that benefited everyone, whoever they were. And, that meant really thinking about someone in a leadership position. Do they have the right training? Do they have the right understanding of what their role is? And then it also meant someone with a learning disability, is the work that they do in the house day to day, or the paid work, or the charity work they did in the community, was that right for them? And that really, I think that context is really important when we think about laziness. It's really important not to start pointing the finger, that some people aren't working for their fair share. It makes me think about asylum seekers, who are legally barred from working in the UK, and yet it's such a kind of, there's such a pit of really nasty scaremongering feelings about asylum seekers not working, and taking taxpayers' money. These narratives we're very familiar with, and yet it's ridiculous to blame people for not working when they're seeking asylum, because they legally aren't allowed to. So we have to be really careful about the lens that we view what good work or good labour is. You can't see Paul and Timothy talking about this as laziness, because that doesn't make sense in our modern economy. It only makes sense when we understand the context that they were operating in. I'd also point to verse 13, as for you, brothers and sisters, never tire of doing what is good. I think never tire of doing what is good is a lovely sum up of the Christian message and the gospel. And I'm very glad that we can sum it up in such a nice way. So I'd point to that as perhaps a slightly trickier passage, but with a really nice little, slightly pithy but very lovely conclusion about what we are called to go out and do.
There's a famous quote by John Lewis. He was an American civil rights leader that says, go and cause good trouble. Good trouble. So I'm thinking of going to make a t-shirt, taking what you said, Lindsey, and what you said, Thomas, like, keep calm and carry on in the faith. And on the back of it, go and cause good trouble. Because you're right, Thomas. There is something there about context. Like, what does it mean to not be idle in the context of economic inequality? What does it mean to
Mm.
not be idle in the context of political frustration? Because we're certainly living in frustrating time. I don't know about you, but I'm certainly frustrated whenever I encounter an MP or pray about current affairs, topics that are happening right now in our world. There's a frustration. I'll go so far as to say an anger, that I feel like a bit of a prophet now. Like, why, Lord? What's happening? What's going on? So how do we keep calm and carry on in that context? Maybe you'll have some wisdom for me and for our listeners and for the people that we're preaching to. What do we do?
I think one of the things that I would always like to try and encourage people to do, because of course there is a Synod Moderator, I visit people rather than being with them the whole time. But in terms of what some of the things I've shared with Synod at a Synod meeting, it seems to me that one of the first steps in loving your neighbour is to be informed about the context. So I would always be encouraging people to be informed about place and where they are, or the issue that they're presented with, and to try and hear different perspectives and be conscious that there are different perspectives to hear. And so that's why I think it's really important that we not only that we have organisations like JPIT who help us hear the context in different ways. Christian Aid, we can hear directly from our partners and their experience, because we live in a global community, and we cannot separate ourselves off from the global community. And we're bombarded by 24/7 news, but that news comes from a particular lens and with a particular bias. So we do need to inform ourselves, to take time to do that, so that we can then make decisions where we quite literally have kind of our Bible and our newspaper in each hand, and so we can make those decisions about the world informed from our faith perspective.
I think you're thinking about Interfaith Week as well. I think that's so important in terms of being informed of context and thinking about interfaith work in relation to that. I think if we're going to be good and authentic with the way that we relate to other people of other faith communities, which I think everyone agrees is important, but perhaps there can be nervousness around, the intentions, and are they good faith from everyone participating in that? Is there any little temptation to evangelize in a way that isn't respecting the kind of appropriate boundaries of that environment? But something you can really get out of interfaith work, or I've felt anyway, is kind of clarity and reflection on your own faith through dialogue with someone of another faith. You can learn about one another's context and your own context in light of that, and that's a really important dynamic to be able to have both. And that rich relationship building and sharing of the wisdom and knowledge that God inherited within our faith traditions is a form of being in the world but not of the world, and maybe even a form of mission of understanding your own faith and someone else's. And it made me related to the Isaiah 12 passage, thinking about praise. There's this phrase there in verse 3: with joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. I think that's a lovely image of how God is active deep within the world and within ourselves. There's a deep well of salvation, and we draw from it to kind of refresh ourselves in the way that we go about the God-given work and mission that we are called to do. And thinking about Interfaith Week, I think that really resonated. That's how, especially when you're struggling to really find optimism, as you said, Stephen, when you're feeling very angry, often the antidote to that is good relationship building.
Thank you both. I am restored, and it's a helpful segue actually to our next reading from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, verses 5 to 19, where Jesus is warning of turmoil, that's wars, persecution, and upheaval in the world. But Jesus calls his followers to endurance and courage, and that for me is a reminder to endure in unsettled times. A reminder, like you've both said, to preach hope and without denial of what's actually going on in the world in which we live in. There is hope. There is hope. There is hope. So, Luke chapter 21, verse 5 to 19. Lindsey, give us even more hope.
Yeah, well, I think this is the passage that, in a sense, is the bit of the Advent precursor, as we
Yeah.
kind of see that. And you think you could pick up Luke's letter or book today and read it and go, wow, it seems so contemporary in so many different ways. Don't know about destructions of the temple and the demolition of the East Wing. Maybe that's just a step too far, but who knows? Who knows? I think certainly there's a critique of power here, and that's something that we see, and a real sense in that passage coming through of the accepted world order being challenged. And I think, again, if we reflect on the events of 2025, many people would acknowledge that much of what we in past we had taken for granted as being the world order is being challenged and in many instances unpicked, which is a cause of immense concern and anguish to lots of us. So I think for me, Luke is saying here that because he's the destruction of the temple's already happened, although when he's writing, although it's kind of written as something that will happen. So why is it written like this way? And is it the case that what Luke is offering to those who would read his gospel first is, again, an element of understanding of what is the context and how can we find meaning in what has happened, and what is the kind of direction of travel, perhaps, that we need to take as this still quite fledgling Christian community that I'm sure had lots of anxieties as it sought to kind of establish itself within a context of empire and everything that was kind of happening in first century Roman Empire. So I think the things that I draw out of this are about there is a huge element of unpredictability in the world. There are many, many things that we have no control of, and we might feel that we're very much like pawns on a chessboard if we see that there are other political movements, there are multinational corporations that seem to have so much power and influence in our world. But what comes out for me here is about God's presence. And again, looking forward just a few weeks to Advent and then to the Incarnation, we see the reality of God's presence in a very tangible way in the person of Jesus. And we look to that celebration. So there's something there about God's presence with that new community and with us across time and space. And again, the call to remain faithful in the face of everything that is happening. Not that we're going to be protected necessarily from what is happening, but we can be assured of God's presence with us throughout all the trials and tribulations and the persecution that we may endure. And I think then Luke says something really surprising in that he talks about bearing witness, but he talks about not being prepared. Don't prepare yourself. Now, that really gives me the heebie-jeebies because I'm a person that really wants to be prepared for almost every eventuality that can possibly come, So to follow that advice about you will be able to give witness, but don't prepare yourself for it. Trust in God that the Spirit will let you witness as you are supposed to witness to the love of God, that God will provide the faithfulness, trust and belief. We know these words are also interconnected in the gospel. And so that's where I find more hope, Stephen. I and others, we all together will be able to bear witness to the incarnation of God that we experience through Jesus, and that whole transition from Christmas to Easter, that the promises of God that are fulfilled through the death and resurrection of Christ will mean that, at God's time, this new community of hope will really absolutely and fully come to birth, and we have a part to play in that as children of God, and that is hugely exciting. And I guess is my life's motivation if I want to put it in kind of terms as bold as that, that's what gives me hope as a Christian, and as a friend and follower of Jesus.
Amen. And as a fellow friend and follower of Jesus, that gives me hope and petrol too, for the days and seasons ahead. You just reminded me, Lindsey, inadvertently, of a fantastic scripture in the book of James. In the first chapter, it says, if my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that testing of your faith produces endurance, and let your endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete and lacking in nothing. They're a reminder for me about just enduring and having faith, in the days and seasons that are ahead. Not denying what's happening, but actually having faith that God is with you. God is with us. Thomas, any words of hope from you?
Not as many, I suppose. I think we've covered enough hope. I think
What? What?
no. To be honest, I also slightly read into this passage what I think something God is really encouraging the church in Britain to think about at the moment is the way that Christian imagery, ideas, and symbols are being used in sort of far right and extremist discourses. And I think what this little chat about Christmas made me think that is one of the moments where this is such a familiar cultural touch point for people in the UK still as a Christian basis, and it really makes me think about how can we use that as a way to stake a claim to the liberation and peace, justice, and freedom that Jesus promises, rather than the Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that often we have seen in the last few months coming out and coming associated with Christian nationalism. That's not very hopeful, but I do think that the end of the passage, not a hair on your head will perish, stand firm and you will win life. Great phrase, win life, is a kind of ever expansive kind of reference to what the future could look like. So definitely these passages, there's a lot of thinking about standing up to authority. There's in Psalm 118, it's talking about not placing your hope in princes, humans or princes. I like that it distinguishes between those, and instead trusting God. And throughout this thinking of kind of the other world, something new, renewal, as we saw in the Isaiah as well, and definitely here, and thinking about that Christmas represents that renewal. So I would see that, but I would see that mirrored with our responsibility, looking back to the 2 Thessalonians, to fight against the use of Christianity in a way that stamps down on vulnerable people and minorities in our country. So I'm sorry, Stephen, that wasn't as hopeful as perhaps you would have wanted.
Yeah,
but
no, don't.
I find hope.
Don't apologize. that I found that very hopeful, actually. I found that very hopeful, because this passage, you very helpfully reminded us all, should help us to shape our response to crisis in Gaza and Sudan and every other area of conflict in our world. And that's the real deal, enduring in unsettled times. I think, especially when there is persecution, we need, as people of God, to stand up and be counted, and to encourage and pray and do whatever we can to sow seeds of peace. I love that imagery, because we live in a world where people expect to sow seeds of discontent, sow seeds of racism, and end up with seeds of fruit of beauty, or it's like, in my mind, planting a banana tree and expecting to grow pears. It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. So thank you for that very hopeful reminder. Yes, Lindsey.
I'm just thinking of a banana tree with pears. Yeah, that was all.
Well, but if we look back at the Isaiah, then that's the upturning of the agricultural and ecological cycles of the world. That's what God promises. Perhaps we can one day, but yes,
that's right.
Our responsibility to plant good seeds and expect good fruit. I think that is something the church is well placed to do in the long term.
There's a handshake there, or what I like to call a high five, between the Luke reading and Isaiah 12, because there's Luke talks about you all have an opportunity to give thanks, And then Isaiah 12 is a song of thanksgiving, a gratitude, a song of salvation. Surely God is my salvation. I will trust and I will not be afraid. I think in these times that we're living in, gratitude looks different for each and every one of us, especially in hard times, especially where suffering is dominating the news. But thanksgiving is an opposite of that. It's a proclamation of hope despite despair. It's good trouble. It's good work to offer hope in a world filled with darkness, light in the darkness. Especially in Interfaith Week, we can, we might have shared gratitude in our community. What are we thankful for in the community that we're serving, where we worship, where we're looking and seeking justice? What can we be thankful for in that? And there's one line there that I found really, it spoke to me in a deep way, and I'd like to hear what you think about it. It says, "Draw water with joy from the wells of salvation." I think we live in a thirsty world. I once preached on the tiger that came to tea, in conjunction with another reading. So don't worry, it was still from the Bible. But the point was, people are thirsty. There's one image that really sticks with me from the tiger that came to tea. It's when he fills the bathtub with water and he just drinks it, and it's down to the last drop. And I'm thinking of this spiritually and environmentally. In a thirsty world, what can we do to help quench people's thirst using the good news that we live and share?
Yesterday we had the parable, the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus,
Yes.
in the lectionary. And the church where I was leading worship, I was encouraging them to think about becoming more like Jesus in that story, in terms of being the one who was inviting. And I think as churches we've become very good at welcoming people, but often we find it more difficult to invite people. And so I think if we find ways in which we are able to invite people to come and taste the water, and we all know how good and refreshing clean water, fresh water can be. And so finding a whole range of different opportunities for people to come and taste and see that the Lord is good as well. So I think to be as creative as we can about inviting people to come and taste that living water kind of picks up on that image from Isaiah. And other ones as well, again, Psalm 23, but my cup runs over. It's a very rich image, isn't it, of the water of life that just flows right through, actually, the whole biblical narrative.
Especially thinking of communion as well, where we are quenched and fed, again, for the days and seasons ahead. Lindsey and Thomas, my thanks to you both, and thanks to our listeners and viewers. Thank you for listening and watching. I hope that this episode helps you in your preaching preparation. It's been really exciting for me. I'm going to go and geek out some more and read more scripture and more commentaries, and as we prepare these sermons together. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, wherever you listen to your podcasts or watch them, and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms. As Isaiah reminds us, God is making all things new, not by magic, but through people. People who live out hope, who embody hope, especially when others give up. And Paul is encouraging us not to grow weary. And Jesus is calling us to endure with faith and courage. So as we look at our world, which is weary from war, injustice, and climate anxiety, may we be those who keep building, keep believing, and keep singing songs of hope. So I'm going to leave you with this quote that we did quote earlier, thanks to Lindsey. This quote from Barack Obama. And it's a quote actually from Lindsey that I'm going to amalgamate and put together and share with you now. It says, "Be infected by the audacity of hope. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Have a good
Amen.
week, folks.